that they've really done most of the work in putting together and getting one here, but we're happy to co-host it with them. We think it's great. After I was just telling someone, I still keep thinking it's 2020 because where did the past 3 years and COVID go? So it's great to have a post-COVID, hopefully, kind of conversation and start using this facility the way it was intended to be used. So again, welcome, and I'll turn it over to Andrew.
Thank you. And thanks all for coming. I'm Andrew Ryan, president of the Citizens Budget Commission, and for those of you who don't know, we are a 91-year-old nonprofit, nonpartisan government watchdog and think tank, headquartered in New York City, but have a strong Albany presence with our Director of State Studies, Patrick Orecki, leading our charge up here. I want to thank you all for coming. You guys are the people who know how important this is. You guys are the people who know that it's not about it sounds a little bit like it's accounting and wonky process stuff, but at the end of the day, if you fix the process, you will have, better services for New Yorkers, better input reflecting better decisions reflecting better input, more sustainable, steady government that can actually provide over time to managers up and down the chain. But as important, or probably more important, there's more accountability to New Yorkers for how their money is being spent and doing it well. So this is about how to change the budgeting and fiscal management process. But at the end of the day, it's really about the results for New Yorkers. I want to thank Bob and Rockefeller for co-hosting this. You've done a couple of things. The institution have done a couple of things with us over the years, and it's great to have a partner, and it's great to have Bob's counsel on many things. So thank you all. Thanks, Patrick, for working on the paper. I want to thank all our panelists, because that's why you guys are all here, because we luckily put together a great group of people with various perspectives. And frankly, we have a report, we have recommendations. Some people agree with all of them, some none. But we need the engagement. We need this discussion. We need this progress for all of us. So I just want to also say that sometimes it feels like change can never come. When I started this, which was a while ago, I had hair, and I won't call out who's laughing at these because you joined me on some of this stuff. Thank you, Henry. But when I started, one of the things my bosses had me do was a baseline budget for New York State to set how big the budget gap was going to be next year. Because except for Rudy Runco's one memo after Mario Cuomo lost the election saying there was a $5 billion budget gap, no one, I think, ever said that before and had any analysis or any numbers to it. So my bosses told me that I should do that. That was fun. But we now have a multi-year financial plan. We now actually talk about what size the budget gap is. We now have a debt cap. We now have improvements. Just last year, the rainy day fund. It's not enough, but change can happen. And I think we need to look at that progress over time and realize how important it is and that it is possible. So it feels like it's timeless, this discussion, but it's actually very timely with the newly elected governor and the pandemic semi behind us and the new abnormal we're sitting in here. We've seen some things over the last couple of years right before the pandemic that remind us how important this is. So thank you all for being here, for coming, our panelists. And Bob, kick it off with Patrick.
Great. Patrick, we're kicking it off with you.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm Patrick Orecki, the Director of State Studies for the CBC. So just before we get into the meat of the event today with the panels, I'm just going to go through a couple slides in 3 minutes about what our research was to kind of frame the discussion, and kind of why we're here, why we convened, and think this event is so important. So the first couple questions are just why budget reform and why right now? I think Andrew described pretty well why budget reform is so important and process actions are so important, but why now? It's been basically 15 years since the last kind of comprehensive or major budget process reforms in about 2007 were enacted. And then in the Great Recession, there was a lot of discussion about big kind of seismic changes to the budget process as a way of getting the financial plan back on a sound footing. But since then, especially because we've been in kind of good economic times for the most part for the last 12 or so years, there hasn't been as much discussion about process and fiscal management structure. So that's one big reason. And the other is that there are still gaps in the state's process. Like Andrew said, there's been a ton of progress. The state does really well on some things. You know, we pulled 2 grades from the Volcker Alliance's national kind of scorecard of state budget process. And the state gets really good marks for forecasting and for reporting on the budget, less good marks for some of the maneuvers that the state uses.
The stuff I used to do, you got an A on it, right?
Yeah.
Notice that.
So that's kind of why we took on the research project and also why we wanted to convene this event. So as we were going through, CBC identified kind of 4 main problem areas. The first is what we called fiscal management and stability. This is the area that touches on that budget maneuvers thing, how cash is moved between accounts or fund types across years, those types of accounting maneuvers, how the state saves and plans its debt structure as well as in this bucket. Other problems are in the areas of what we're calling transparency, essentially having the right time and information to make budget decisions during the process and to manage the budget throughout the year. The third is in oversight, the external or even internal government monitors that watch the budget process and watch the fiscal management of the state. Did they have all the authority that they need and the resources that they need to fully execute on their responsibilities of budget oversight? And then the fourth bucket is accountability. So making sure that the money that is allocated and spent by the state is spent well, and that the state is making decisions based on information about the performance of its programming and of its spending to inform the next budget process and direct resources to the most urgent areas as well. And so for each of those 4 sort of problem areas, we at CBC identified 4 matching strategies to address them and 12 specific actions within them. They're in our report. The executive summary is outside as well. So I won't go into too much detail, but it's about moving away from just cash management of the budget to a gap-based system. This gets at that budget maneuvers D grade that we got from the Volcker Alliance, changing how the state is able to move cash and move funds across funds. Things like tying appropriations to spending more tightly, not having as much loose appropriation authority, a stronger debt cap and rainy day fund as well are in here. In transparency, we recommend including basic financial plan tables with the one house and enacted budget bills. We're not talking about a 400-page financial plan like DOB puts out with the executive and enacted, but basic financial plan summaries with those bills. Similar estimates with legislation, not using messages of necessity to skip aging on budget bills in March and April, and improving kind of the public-facing long-term capital planning that the state already does. In the third bucket, we and many other good government groups previously have recommended additional resources for the ABO in its role of overseeing the 600 authorities that the state has, establishing an independent fiscal analyst office or an IBO or a legislative budget office, goes by many different names, but a similar concept. One bit of good news already since we put out the report, something that had long been in the works was restoring the controller's oversight, one of our 12 recommendations that many groups in this room have recommended as well. That is now mostly done, which is good news. And I think that means that at this current trajectory, we should get all 12 of these recommendations done by the end of the year, which is great. And then the final thing is in accountability, setting up a public performance measurement and management system for the state to make better informed decisions during the budget process. So that's kind of the gist of it. I'll say just kind of in closing, this is CBC's research. It's our recommendations. It's not the universe of what we'll discuss today, and hopefully we agree and disagree on plenty of it over the course of the 3 panels. So let's get right to it.
Thank you. Being a biased observer of all of the stuff that's being talked about today, I'll try to be judicious in my comments, but let's jump right into this panel today, which I think, to me, Andrew and I were talking, and this was a panel I think I wanted to do because the world has changed. I've been, I first came, I don't want to make this sound like a history thing. I worked as a Senate fellow for Senator Manfred Orenstein in 1978. And so When I started, and we have our media folks later in the day, we had two, a morning and an afternoon newspaper in Albany. You had significant resources dedicated on the media side of the world to covering the budget and talking about it. Now, what we have really are the folks on this panel. We have policy people who come at policy issues from a particular perspective, usually. But I think today, in this day and age, it's where many of us get our information on the budget that doesn't come directly from the agencies such as DOB or the legislature or the controller's office or other outside groups. And I think that's been a subtle but persistent change over time. And I think, therefore, we listen much more carefully to what folks who represent these entities talk to us about. So rather than hearing from me, let's hear from them. So I'm going to start with Rachel. Hopefully we could just do like short introductions and just jump into a conversation about, the budget from your guys' perspective.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I am the senior policy advisor for Reinvent Albany. Oh, there goes the mic. And Reinvent Albany works for a more transparent and accountable state government. So the areas that touch on our priority issues within the presentation that Patrick just made really are a lot that involve transparency and oversight. So, we fought very hard to restore the comptroller's oversight powers. This was stripped away 10 years ago, and it took that long to get it back, but it finally was. And, we really do thank Governor Hochul and the legislative leaders for keeping the law strong, the new law strong, and making sure that happened. And, one area I wanted to talk about too a little bit that I'll save most of for later is transparency. We fought very hard also for the open data executive order that Governor Cuomo put in place in 2013. But the thing I'd like to caution is that while we do have more open data, that's spreadsheets rather than having to read a 500-page budget bill or more, as you all know, open data really comes after all the decisions are made. When you're talking about transparency, it's not just having the information after decisions are made, it's being able to evaluate and for the public to weigh in before they're made. And unfortunately, we don't have that with the state budget process, largely because, as many of us know, with messages of necessity and last minute discussions, March 31st is the most important day. In some ways, it doesn't matter how much is in the governor's executive budget that everybody gets, 2 or more months to review. Sometimes, billions of dollars of decisions are made in that last 24-hour period, and you don't get open data in that. You're lucky if the rank and file legislators can even read the bill before they vote on it. So, I know we'll have a lot of time to talk about all of these things, but from our perspective, the transparency and accountability really comes not just from the laws we have, but also the culture and the process and what the public can see in the budget before the decisions are made.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Jasmine Gripper, the Executive Director of the Alliance for Quality Education. We are a statewide advocacy group focused on organizing parents in Black, Brown, and low-income communities around racial justice and education. And one of our priority issues where AQE was founded on was around state resources and funding for high-need communities. And for the communities that we work in Buffalo, in New York City, in Rochester, in Albany, these districts are heavily reliant on state aid to fund their schools. And so what happens in the state budget really matters on the ground to education in these communities. Yet for the parents in these communities, what happens in Albany seems really far from them. And without AQE's advocacy, without our presence on the ground, for parents, the process is extremely opaque. They have no idea how the budget is being done. They have no idea how to engage with their legislators. And they have no idea what's going on throughout the process. And that's the role we play. We make sure parents are at the table. We make sure we are bridging the gap so that parents can weigh in and be a part of the process. And absent from us, then parents would not be able to really engage in Albany, would not be able to come here. Like, you know, one of the things we even provide are free buses for parents to come to Albany and talk to their members. And we really inform parents how to be active members in the process during the budget. And as we get to crunch time, as folks know, like get to the end of the process, the very last weeks of budget, they rely on us to be the eyes and ears on the ground around how negotiations are shaping out and what's happening. And I agree. I think there's a point where rank and file members have no idea what's happening in the budget. And we're talking about billions of dollars that impact our communities, that shape what resources are available. And so it feels irresponsible to have to depend on grassroots, nonprofit groups to fill such a huge gap in New York State and to provide this vital service. We don't get any resources from the state. We do this through our own fundraising efforts and provide these services, provide buses, and we have to figure out how to do that as a 501c3, C4 organization. And the state has not put any effort into making a significant attempt to reach out to parents, to reach out to regular New Yorkers, to help them engage in the state budget process. And if it's absent from advocacy groups filling this role, a lot of community members would not be in Albany yelling and screaming in the Capitol throughout budget season around what's happening. And with education being such a large portion of the budget, it's important that parents are a part of that process, and that's a role that we often fill.
Good morning. This thing's on, right? My name is Blair Horner. I'm NYPIRG's Executive Director. NYPIRG is a statewide, not-for-profit, nonpartisan research and advocacy organization. I've worked with NYPIRG since 1979, and my first session here in Albany was 1984, in some ways appropriately enough. Thanks to CBC and Rockefeller Institute for holding this event. I think it's really important. The budget is about the public's money, and too often that gets short shrift. So I just have a few comments. I've been looking at the budget for a long time, so mainly, always as an outsider, not as an insider. First comment is a tip of the hat. New York does provide a wealth of information on its budget. The work is professional. The lawmakers take their role seriously, and the process itself is well organized. Second, the budget is a political document. Decisions made are driven by the wealthy and the powerful. If an organization or collection of organizations have the money for hot-wired lobbyists and campaign contributions, they can have a big budget impact. Now, most New Yorkers do not fit into that category, other than what we just heard. And you don't have to rely on my observation. A former governor was so convinced that this was true that he cooperated in the creation of an outside group, the Commission to Save New York, the Committee to Save New York, funded by real estate interests, to balance what he perceived would be opposition to his budget plans in 2011. Third point, the short timetable and early beginning of the state's fiscal year drives the process to be less public-facing than it should be. Budget hearings are really about the executive's plans with comments by some stakeholders, typically the interest groups that have the money. The legislative joint budget process provides virtually no public reporting. The final budget is often rammed through without any meaningful public responses. And lastly, it's impossible for the public to know if the appropriations are successfully delivering the services that the budget purports that they do. The fourth, use of lump sum appropriation not only allows for spending that is outside the legislative debate over state spending, it raises the risk of corruption, both legal corruption and illegal corruption. And lastly, there needs to be more independent, adequate oversight of the budget process and spending by the state of all kinds. New York recognizes this need with the requirement that the comptroller be a separately elected official, having an additional entity, one directed by independent professional civil servants, like New York City has, would stand in the shoes of the public in monitoring the state's finances, but also acting as the public's educator of the process. Funding there is key. We like the recommendations made by CBC, but the funding of these groups is critical. The authority's budget office was enacted with great fanfare 15 years ago, and yet what hurt it was the fact that it was not funded at the level that people promised it was going to be funded 15 years ago. Still isn't. So we think that the funding is going to be key to the recommendations, and we think having more watchdogs helps do that. EJ?
Oh, well, thank you. I'm E.J. McMahon. I'm founding senior fellow, as the card says, of the Empire Center, which is an independent public policy think tank. Senior fellow, as you know, means old guy. I'm very well qualified for this position. I'm also an adjunct fellow at the Manhattan Institute, which means guy who comes around occasionally. So I'm very well qualified for that also. My checkered career started in journalism. It's now called journalism. It was then reporting. I was a newspaper reporter, and I was at the Knickerbocker News and then the Times Union. And I morphed into substances, the late David Schaefer used to say. And one of my stops, career-wise, over 30 years ago, was a 4-year tenure as the staff director of the Ways and Means Committee for Republicans in the State Assembly, which was a formative period for me and eye-opening, because I had been close on the outside with my nose pressed to the glass in a lot of ways, and then I was on the inside. So there's a lot of aspects of this to touch on. I'll just touch on one that is a bias of mine or a point of view I've had that started back then. Jasmine said something that I've heard many, many times, which is rank and file members have no idea what's going on, referring to the legislature. And I understand why she says that, because among other things, it's been said so much, among other things, by members. It's not completely true. And I would focus on a lot of the failings in the budget process are failings of the legislature. What leaders do in the legislature reflects what their members are willing to let them do. The lack of transparency and accountability in the legislative part of the budget process can largely be blamed on the legislature. It's not the fault of the Article 7 of the Constitution or of some overbearing governor. And a lot of what we talk about today, I think, could be corrected or improved if the legislature itself took more seriously its role, and if members of the legislature took more seriously their roles. I would just differ in nuance, I think, respectfully, with the view that, there needs to be a greater public role in budgeting. This is what we elect the legislature to do. The governor is elected to be a strong executive who sets the table and who shapes the budget. That's the way our system works here. The legislature, however, not a dime can be spent or raised without the legislature's approval. And we elect legislators to do that because it's a complex process involving a lot of complex issues. And so my bias, such as it is, as we get into this discussion, will be the things the legislature needs to do and understand about its own role. I'll close with one thing. You've all heard the phrase, 3 men in a room. I know the man who invented that phrase, which was, it actually was popularized by my old boss, Clarence Rappelier, great man. He was a Republican leader in the legislature, most consequential political figure in New York in the last half century who too few people have heard of or appreciate. However, a lot of Rapp's comments were brewed up internally by Rapp's communications director, Gary Paslow, was great with the turn of phrase. 3 men in a room, if you're old enough to remember a movie called 3 Men and a Baby, that's where that comes from. Of course, now it's 2 women and a man in a room. But that was seen as descriptive of everything that's wrong with the budget process. I think that is a wrong term. There's always going to be 3 people in the room at some point. That's not the problem. And to the extent that too much is resolved by 3 people in a room, it's because the legislature let it be that way. And in closing, when I was working in the legislature, we were the minority. And the system you still have here, nobody told us anything. And Rapp, to his credit, made us go out and dig around and come up with information and inform our members as well as we possibly could. And we had Republican senators from down the hall would come down the hall to the assembly and ask their people they viewed as their juniors and almost subordinates, what's going on? What do you hear about this bill? Because we were making it our work to tell them and to find out what we could. And their own leadership was keeping them in the dark, not that they were complaining about it, mind you, in their own conference. So there's a dynamics in the legislature, I think, are largely responsible for many of the, not all of them, not the accounting defects in particular in the budget. But I think that that's something that needs to get more attention.
Okay, I want to thank the panelists for their introductions. We're going to have to keep an eye on how long we let EJ
I'm sorry.
go on.
Sorry. That's it. I'll say nothing more.
No, I'm only joking. I think that's a good point because getting to the legislative role in the process, I think, is critical. to this conversation. But why don't we throw it open a little bit? As a person who's been an insider, let me throw out something EJ touched on and get people's view on it. Again, I know I'm biased, so I throw it out there with that in mind. No one's going to negotiate budget issues in public. I mean, it's not going to happen. I don't care what kind of reform we get. I just don't see that happening. So in the absence of that kind of, and by the way, I lived through David Patterson putting 5 legislative leaders in front of a room to negotiate the budget in public. Didn't go really well. And so people figured that out because people need to compromise their positions and they're not going to do that in public. So I'd love the view of folks on the panel. You know, how do we get, or, you know, since that's not going to happen, how do we make the process better? How do we make it more open for the public to see?
I do want to respond to some of the things that EJ said and respectfully disagree. The reason why 3 men in the room was really problematic is because it was 3 white men in the room, which is not really representative of the state of New York. And our state is a lot more diverse than just 3 white men. And so, yes, it's okay that there's 3 people negotiating the budget, but when those 3 people don't actually reflect the diversity of the state, it becomes really problematic because they're not representing all of our views. I think the other part about people being elected and we choose our elected officials to represent us, our elected officials are often driven by money in politics and their campaign donors. And the only way we can combat big money, of course, is there's campaign finance reform, but it's people power. And so people coming to Albany and showing up and being a counter to the big money is absolutely essential to our state government not being run by people who can hire big powered lobbyists and people who don't have money and real estate connections. Like, we know the banks and real estate run Albany. And the counter to that is people showing up and saying our elected officials are not just beholden to the money, they're beholden to the people and the communities they represent. And we absolutely have to hold them accountable. And if we're not here, if we're not watching them, then our government becomes hijacked by the ultra wealthy. And it's really important that in New York, all of us are able to show up and be a counterbalance to the money running things in New York. And that is why we absolutely need more transparency. That is absolutely why we need more community representation. And that's absolutely why we need to rein in big spending in our campaigns and in elections, because without it, the 1% are ruling this elections and are ruling our state and are ruling the policy decisions that elected officials make.
Rachel?
I was going to say, I absolutely agree with Jasmine's statements about money in politics. I mean, I think that, it is absolutely no secret that, millions of dollars go into the campaign coffers of our elected officials. And something that Robert just mentioned, it's not just the decisions being made not in public. It's also that a lot of decisions are made even outside of the budget process altogether. So, for example, why we need independent oversight of the public authorities of New York State. 96% of the debt in New York is issued by public authorities. 96%. So that doesn't happen during the regular budget process, by and large. The authorities might get an authorization or a debt cap, like the MTA has a debt cap that the legislature approves. But all those bonds, those go through those public authority boards. They're not done by our elected officials. They aren't the ones making the decisions. It's public authorities. And then also, it's worth noting that a lot, and I know Blair touched on this, the lump sum appropriations. In the budget, it's not as if everything is spelled out when the legislature votes on it. It's not as if the governor and the legislative leaders make a decision and you know exactly where all the money is going on April 1st. We don't. There are billions of dollars where the funding is left to be decided later by the legislative leaders, by the governor. Sometimes you can see those memorandum of understanding and know where the money goes, but the rank and file members don't have any role in the spending of that money unless they happen to be close to the leader. And then that gets to that sort of issue of legislative power. So, I think the problem is even broader than just the decisions being made behind closed doors and then the budget being voted on. It's that so much of the state budget process happens, outside of the budget process altogether. So much of the spending decisions, I should say, happens outside of the budget process altogether.
Just a couple of comments. I mean, I think EJ's points about the legislature stepping up are good. That makes sense. I mean, there are mechanisms in place for there to be a public discussion of what's going on in the budget. There is a joint conference committee process, which I think if anybody's been watching it, I think knows it is sham. There's nothing that happens. They meet once just to meet the technical requirements of the law. And the point of those things is not necessarily to negotiate the budget in public. It's just to let the public know what's going on. And so there are things that are already built in that are not taken seriously. The idea that our elected officials are elected to handle complex subjects like a $220 billion budget, of course, is true. We live in a representative democracy. But voters cannot give their informed consent unless they have information. And that's where the system starts to break down. There's no real easy way to know how the government's performing until there's a crisis. There's a COVID pandemic, and all of a sudden we find out that there's big problems with the health department. There's a pandemic, and all of a sudden we find out there's big problems with unemployment insurance. All of these things were festering problems that no one was digging into. And you can't just tell agencies year after year after year that they have flat budgets and not expect that you're going to end up with hollowed out agencies whose responsibility is to deliver services to the public. So the budget process is really important, both with regard to how our elected officials behave, but also about the sort of the information that's provided to the public that can hold them accountable, elected officials, and inform the public so that when they're thinking about what's going on with the budget or when they're thinking about who to vote for, they have some information to base it on. New York City has the mayor's management report, which is a way to sort of twice a year to sort of evaluate agency performances. They have an independent budget office that not only monitors what the city's doing in terms of its finances, but also provides like an educational information to the public to understand better how the process works. Those are two good places to start. And for the legislature in particular to take seriously its requirements under the public hearing process with the budget, which is sort of a chaotic thing now, and it's really largely just agency budget presentations, and the conference committee process itself.
I knew I was going to get in trouble. I knew I was going to get in trouble today. Several people have mentioned the IBO. I'm on the IBO board. I can tell you they themselves have issues about what their role should be in government and how they fulfill that mission that, I mean, several of our members have outlined. And I think often an entity like CBC is filling that role in a way that I think the IBO envisioned itself filling that role. So it's kind of interesting when we set up outside entities to kind of fix perceived problems. Again, real problems. I don't want to say perceived problems, real problems. So can folks say if they had to do one or two things, what would you do?
I guess
You heard mine. I would just add, just to Bob's point though, I mean, in a system of two major political parties battling it out and cutting whatever deals they have, you need civil service type systems in place to deal with the excesses that result from that. And right now, that gets cut off in some of the government agencies. These IBO, the idea that I was talking about just now, I envision that as like similar. Like you need an active, competent civil service system to handle the public side of governance, not rely on the two major political parties to do the public interest.
Can I just say very quickly, 30 seconds on that? I would suggest that what you need is something modeled on the CBO. That is a legislative budget office, which exists in several states, including California. Senator Liz Krueger had a bill in on this at least a session ago that I think was a perfect solution. Now, there is no such thing as a self-correcting mechanism, internally or externally, in this process. But in terms of providing more information and more useful information and analysis, a legislative budget office, I think that is set up the way the CBO, for instance, is in Congress. Despite polarization in Congress, it's very respected. California has a legislative analyst office. I suggest you look at it online. I think that could be beneficial in terms of providing more information on a more timely basis for legislators so that they're better informed and the public.
I know the authority's budget office has come up a lot, and I know it's in the Citizens Budget Commission report, but just to give an idea, right now its budget is 2.8 million with an M, and they have to oversee 600 public authorities. We think their budget needs to be doubled. They need 5 million to at least attempt to fulfill their mandate. That's one concrete ask that could happen in the budget. And, when you're talking about a couple $1 million and billions of dollars of debt, as I said, 96% of the state's debt is held by public authorities. That's a very good investment if those billions of dollars of debt can be spent, reined in. And then also, I think on the question of the independent budget office or a legislative budget office, I understand the sort of concern that it's hard for them to meet their role, but I just point to something the IBO did recently that was really helpful for the public discussion. The governor's Penn Station project had a lot of questions about the finances, and we weren't getting answers from Empire State Development. So Reinvent Albany, with a number of other advocacy groups and some state senators, Senator Hoylman, asked the IBO to do a report about the Penn Station project and what questions and answers the public needed to have to better understand the project. And it gave a very, it's one thing for an outside group or a group like Reinvent Albany or Citizens Budget Commission. Groups like ours play a very important role, but it's a different thing when you have a nonpartisan government professional agency issue a report. I think their report was very important as part of the public discussion about the deficiencies of that project. So, having that at the state level would be very, very helpful. So we definitely support that recommendation.
And I'll just add, I think there are mechanisms in place where public engagement is supposed to happen in the budget process, but I think they're often the illusion of transparency, the illusion of engagement, and not real engagement. And a great example of this would be the hearings, right? The budget hearings. And the education hearing, we, as an advocacy group who organizes parents and bring them to Albany, we never bring parents to the education hearing because it is the worst process ever to have to sit in that room for hours, be told you will testify at 1 or 2, and not be called up until 6 or 7 p.m. And so really, we have a process that says we want to hear from you. We want to hear from the public. How is this executive budget going to impact you? And people can respond. People could share their stories. But because the process is so long, because the process is so focused on the agencies, that we actually don't get to hear from the general public. And so I think the mechanism that we have in place where we have availability for accountability and transparency should actually be used to prioritize public voice and public perspective coming into the process and making sure that we don't just have the illusion of transparency, but actually real transparency. And I think the other thing we should think about is when you think about agencies like the State Education Department, it's independent of the executive, which means the Education Department is often more honest about what's happening in education. It's more honest about what it means when they're flat funded or they're not getting the resources. And other agencies are often quiet about how they're hemorrhaging because they've been flat funded. And so how do we allow some more breathing room for agencies to really say what's happening within their doors and how the budget actually impacts them in a factual way, and not for them to always be scared of being punished by the executive for telling and speaking the truth about what's really happening.
And I can't pick 1 or 2 because we just wrote these 12, so I have all of them in my mind. But I will say some of these things are much bigger lift, something like standing up a new IBO or LBO type of concept. There's plenty of actions in the things we've discussed and in the things in the reports that can be done administratively immediately and hopefully this year. Things like continuing to put out financial plan updates on time, completing the quick start process. I think the legislature, the governor, the controller all deserve a ton of credit for completing that process twice in a row the last 2 years. So we thank them for that, including the basic financial plan tables with one House bills and with the enacted bills when they're introduced. I think is a simple, very actionable step that can and should be taken this year.
Can I throw one out? Because I think this is an inherent issue. I think often and I think Jasmine got to it, and I think Rachel got to it a little bit, and EJ. Often we're trying to patch things that never should have been done in the first place. So when we talk about an authority's budget office, why do we have public authorities? So to my mind, you occasionally are gonna find yourself in hot water when you try to fix something that's inherently broken from day one. And, again, yeah, 98% of capital funding gets done through public authorities because of the way we have the Constitution in New York set up on issuing debt. It's, I have no view on how, or I do have a view, but I don't want to go into it on how you fix it. But fixing public authorities maybe isn't the issue. Maybe the issue is not having public authorities.
In the magic wand category, as you may all recall, former Governor Cuomo talked a lot about Al Smith's book from 1911 about reorganizing state government, and that he was going to do that, and ended up with the Sage Commission, which, as far as I could tell, the biggest outcome of that was the merging of the banking and insurance departments and not much else. But there was an idea then that, it's been 100 years, maybe we should be looking at these things.
Yeah.
Now that's a huge lift because a lot of the stuff deals with constitutional issues, and you needed somebody who would be committed to it, and it's not the kind of thing that's fanfare like cutting a ribbon to open up the Second Avenue subway to create a commission to look at reorganizing the government. But it is an issue. I think it's a legitimate issue that we should be looking at as a state because of the state population has been largely stagnant now for a long time. There's different levels of business activity all across the state. How much of that the government can impact? Who knows? But is the government that we have, the way it's set up now, actually responsive to the needs of the 21st century is, I think, a legitimate question that someone should tackle. But I didn't know I was going to talk about that today. I thought we were just going to talk about getting the legislature to have open hearings on the budget. I agree with Jasmine, and to have the joint conference committee process be more substantive.
Come on, Blair,
I
go
like
for
the
it.
magic wand idea, though.
Go for it.
How about no more new public authorities and no subsidiaries being spun off by public authorities where it's even harder to track the money? I mean, there's some, maybe we can't dismantle the entire public authority system, but maybe we can at least stop spinning off more.
Right, and cutting back the powers of the comptroller to monitor.
Yeah.
There's one idea that, and the only person who touched on this so far is Blair, and it's not, and I don't think in the CBC recommendations. It's not as far-fetched as it might sound, and it might create a void into which rush more reforms, which is changing the fiscal year, which is not a constitutional issue. It's a statutory issue. It was statutorily changed to April 1st in the early 40s. It was July 1st when the executive budget was enacted. It's July 1st in all other states except, I think, 2. And if you suddenly lengthen the time, none of these things are guarantees of good results. But if you suddenly opened up this period of 3 more months, I think that into that void might rush a better process, because right now the current time frame actually provides a semi-legitimate excuse for too much of what's wrong with the way we do budgets in New York State.
Yeah, I mean, that's the excuse, right? That's just why instead of you have one round of hearings for the budget process for everyone to be smooshed into. If you had more time, you could have 2, one for the agencies, one for the public. That actually needs to be done.
The city does. I mean, the city does pretty well and has been fairly disciplined with similar political, dynamics, if not even more unbalanced in some sense. But they have it's known that there is the first budget. This is in other states. The governor puts out this first big budget. Then there's some tweaking of it. The 30-day amendment period becomes like 60 days. The mayor puts out the meat budget in April. And it's known that we're going to have hearings now, then we're going to do this, and there's going to be steps. It's not, a lot of states do it that way. It's not magic.
No, I think bankruptcy would be a great way for us to get to where the city is now.
There's an idea. There's an idea.
When the budget proposal 1 was brought up in 2005, one of the changes was to change the fiscal year. And one of the issues to tackle was, what did you do about the school board votes in May? If you change the fiscal year to July 1, for example. So it does open up somewhat of a can of worms that have implications. But I think it's a legitimate argument by the legislature that they have 3 months to deal with a $220 billion budget. They got to get it done. And when you have that mindset, you're not evaluating, sort of up from 30,000 feet. Does the government work right? You're figuring out, well, 90% of the budget we're just going to accept that the executive gave us. We're going to slug it out over 10%, and we've got to do it fast. We got to brief the members, and get the whole process to go, get done by April 1st-ish. And so that's what effectively, I think, drives a lot of the complaining that, at least the observations, some of the observations I've had in terms of the process, is the very truncated timetable.
And another option would be to move the start of the clock earlier. I mean, this year, the governor has until the 30th to release the executive budget and then 30 days to amend it. You're at March 1st at that point for when the executive budget could be changed. That is a really short clock. So moving the starting times earlier too would open up a little bit of a window.
Rachel?
I was going to make that exact point, but I think that the impact on local governments and agencies, authorities really does need to be considered, because I closely monitored the MTA, and they had to pass a budget in December where they don't know how much money the state is going to give them, and they have a massive operating budget deficit that is coming up. They don't know if they're going to have fare and toll increases. So, a lot of these things need to work together. It's not just a matter of giving the legislature more time. It's also making sure that all the people who are dependent on state funding, all the agencies, all the nonprofits, also can work that into their schedule.
Again, many states handle those problems by doing things like 2-year appropriations, for example, so that you can kind of navigate around some of those issues. I worked for 2 years in a state government that is always ranked as like an A-level government in Virginia. Governing magazine, I don't think it exists anymore. I always use Sarek. I mean, it's like the best fiscally managed state in the country. One of the things they did that I thought was interesting, and it gets to one of EJ's points about the legislature, was they didn't do 3 people in the room. They did committees every year. And yes, the leadership picked the committees, but you always had 3 or 4 or 5 legislators from each house, and it was done on a rotating basis. It was not the same people every year. And it wasn't staff, it was the members. And I think that added, even though it was negotiated in private, I think there was a feeling that the public was being better served by seeing some sort of rotation of the members actually into the budget process. I don't know if they're still doing that or what the politics in Virginia are anymore, but that worked. Democratic, Republican, they seem to be able to manage that process. And then the members couldn't say they didn't own anything. They really had to feel like they owned the budget. Anyway, any other comments from groups, closing remarks from folks, maybe? I don't know where we are time-wise. Okay, so let's keep going then. Issues we haven't hit on?
I mean, one thing I'll say in response to what you mentioned, I think one of the things we're seeing now in New York City with the city council, with so many new members, is the lack of experience. And we're at a point where it feels like the mayor has outsized power because the majority of the city council, this is their first budget. This is their first time in elected office. And so they are giving up their power as elected officials really quickly and really easily because they don't know or understand the process or understand their power. And so I think we also need to do a better job at, educating and informing new members when they take these positions, making sure that they're prepared for these roles. And yes, we want people to run who are everyday people who are from our communities, while also knowing we have to prepare them for what the fullness of the job beyond the issues, especially around budgeting, which is a big task.
can I say, I strongly agree with that. I think there's been a generational change in Albany in the last 10 to 15 years. There's many people in the legislature and somewhat equally important on staff who are a new generation. Now, the plus of that is there's a greater sense of possibilities. You're not as limited by the way we always did things. That's good in many ways because of the way we've done things here. On the other hand, I think there is an issue, and I think having members understand the process better. Everything you said, I think this actually applies to the legislature too. There is another side of it also, though, and this has to do partly with your view on what's ahead, but there are cycles sooner or later in all fiscal cycles. You see this quote on Wall Street a lot now. You see people in the securities industry say, uh-oh, there's too many people working on Wall Street who've never worked here during a bear market or a crash. So they think trees grow to the sky and that nothing really bad will happen. Well, you get ready. That's sort of an old guy lament, but that doesn't make it any less true. I think there's an increasing number of people in Albany who've never been here during a fiscal crisis and who don't understand how quickly things can go south and also the dynamics of how things shift. I mean, Bob, you were on when David Patterson took office. I forget when you replaced Laura, right then or right after then, but that was a really bad situation that Patterson just happened to walk into. There was a meltdown occurring as he was becoming governor, in his first quarter as governor. And if you have memories of that or even further back of the sort of instant fiscal crisis of 2000, 2001, which was not really related to 9/11, it was other things, or the early 90s. There are lessons in those experiences that are now increasingly forgotten, understandably. So there's like pluses and minuses to this. And I think knowing the history is good. I totally agree with what Jasmine said about like members understanding what their role is and what the rules are. It's a great point.
You know, again, I think, and this is a bias that I have, again, I feel like, but I throw it out for folks because I think it ties to what Jasmine said and to what EJ said. You know, when I worked at the Ways and Means Committee, you know, we had someone come in who had been Ways and Means chair in the 1940s when they were actually implementing the change in fiscal year and things like that. And he was wonderful. And one of the things he said was they did everything themselves, right? There was no real staff. When I was in Virginia, the Senate Finance Committee existed and had staff. The House of Delegates, the equivalent of the Assembly in Virginia, had no staff. They had committee clerk. That was it. And so the members were forced to be engaged in the process. And there were pluses and minuses to that, as you would imagine. It gave the executive an enormous amount of power. Again, you had one-term governors, right? So that kind of balanced it a little bit in Virginia. But, you know, the staffing didn't exist to kind of go through every bit of a huge budget, and it forced the members to be much more engaged. But I think the public felt in that process like the people they were electing were involved in the process, were making decisions about how the process worked. And so it's really fascinating how these things develop over time, where obviously staff in the legislature helped enormously the legislature interpret the budget in New York State when you have a strong executive budget process. But to a certain extent, it does remove the members from that piece of having to, really be the driving force.
And all of this is reminding me that it's more than 30, maybe 39 new members of the Assembly coming in. That's a huge number. I think that's something that we haven't seen, and it is more akin to the City Council, where you have term limits and a different process. And that really does mean that the central staff of the Assembly are the ones who are making a lot of the decisions. I mean, as an advocate, everyone knows if you want to influence the budget process, you need to meet with the central staff. Yes, the members play a certain role, but that institutional memory and the career staff, I mean, they are the ones who make these decisions rather than the rank and file. Not the decisions necessarily. They're the ones who interpret They're the ones who give the information to the members. And then when you have a process where decisions are made at the 11th hour, the members don't always know. But again, it's a matter of those members, as EJ said, really exercising their authority and making sure that they assert themselves in the process.
Yeah, I agree. I think members have to assert themselves. I think often they rely on the staff too much. They wait for the yellow book, they wait for the blue book to come out, as opposed to taking the time to read the executive budget themselves, and they wait for the staff to give them the interpretations. And so we do need a process that really forces or helps the members to get more engaged and understand the budget.
I have a question for Blair and EJ, who have avoided this in this panel discussion. Both of them spent about 5 minutes in the executive at different times, and then went back to doing their work with their advocacy groups, which were very, they've been engaged doing that for long periods of time. Why was that? Is that inherent in how you guys think about the process, or was working from the inside not something that was working for you personally? How do you guys view that?
Well, Bob, I assume you're referring to the time when you and I both worked in the tax department, when I was a deputy commissioner in Pataki's first year. In my own case, I learned something, but that I had redoubled. I learned something that I already knew, which is that the decisions are ultimately made on the second floor. So I was involved in drafting Pataki's tax cut bill which was actually Rappley's bill, which Pataki then pretty much implemented half of when he took office. We were doing a lot of work to evaluate what that might mean going in, and then we began working on proposed reforms to the tax code. You may recall, Bob, and then of course, which ran into a complete stone wall in the budget division, which institutionally wants nobody ever to talk about tax reform or tax cuts, full stop. Which I realized, okay, this is going to be 4 years of coming up with interesting ideas that are not actually implemented, but reacting to whatever predictable stuff emerges from the Senate and Assembly. And so that was why I left. But I also another thing it taught me is there are really good professionals that work in many state departments. At that time, the tax department, they were really very impressive and very good at their jobs, very honest and principled. And that's a lasting impression I took away from there, which I didn't doubt it, or I didn't assume the opposite when I went in, but I wasn't prepared to be as favorably impressed as I was, actually.
I am really in the 5-minute category. I worked as a special advisor to then Attorney General Andrew Cuomo. So he was the Attorney General, he wasn't the governor, so I didn't really have an inside view. So my limited, 5-minute limited view from the inside really just sort of strengthened my view that I had from the outside, which is you got to figure out ways to get around everybody who's trying to stop you from doing something. In this case, I was putting together a project. One of my responsibilities was to put together a project called Project Sunlight, which was a way for the Attorney General's office, it's now called Open Government New York, to allow the public to have easy access to campaign contributions, lobbying expenditures, government contracts, etc., in one handy-dandy little place. And they didn't have me do it. I'm like Coco the gorilla when it comes to technology, right? So, but I was there because they didn't want it to seem like it was like Oppo research. That the theory was that this really was something in the public interest. And getting access to things like the bills in electronic format was like a huge problem. It was public information available on the internet, but no one is willing to give it to us. And we figured out how to get it. I won't disclose how that all happened, but I can remember someone on Senator Bruno's staff at the time when we were showing them what this was going to look like. They're like, "How did you get that?" That's what they said. So that was really, it was more of that. It was more like, oh yeah, I recognize the problem here, and the problem is I have to figure out how to get around whatever the obstacles were. But like EJ, I was very impressed with the civil service staff that I dealt with in the Attorney General's office, particularly in the technology side. These guys worked through the Thanksgiving weekend to get the project done on time. We wanted to get it done in early December because the theory was we wanted to get something out before the budget process started, because if not, that would be an excuse to defund what we were doing, right? So you had to try to get something out the door within the first year, which was fine. That was the way I sort of viewed the world anyway. But they worked through the Thanksgiving weekend. I was getting calls on Thanksgiving weekend that glitches and stuff that were showing up as we were working on it. So I was very impressed. Unlike EJ, I didn't have a negative view going into it, but I did have a more positive view coming out of it. 5 minutes though, that was it. I spoke longer than I was there.
Remember, we gave one on the award.
And I'll just out myself very briefly as a former legislative staffer. I worked for a rank and file member when I was in graduate school in 2005 and 6. And the member I worked for was very concerned about education funding and the campaign for fiscal equity and making sure that was implemented. And, you know, as that member, that rank and file member, I mean, we relied, as staffer, we relied on AQE for information. We relied on the legislative staff. And I'll just say, I was a junior staffer then who didn't know what was going on. And a lot of members' offices, it was very similar. So there's a lot of turnover in the legislative staff. They're not paid all that well, and they often move to greener pastures. So there's a real issue in that with the legislative staff and small budgets for the members. There's a huge amount of turnover, and you can see that the impact of that and how members really do rely on central staff.
Thanks, Rich. Jasmine, did I miss you? You haven't spent even 5 minutes.
Not a
on both.
minute. I am a former educator. I used to teach first grade. I stumbled my way into advocacy and found my way in Albany. And I thought I was only I came to AQE for a 4-month position 10 years ago.
But what's been your impression of the folks in government, both legislator and executive, that you've had the chance to work with? Not to put you on the spot or anything, Jack.
Name names, please.
Analogize to first graders.
Some are more pleasant to work with than others. No, I think one of the things I will say about staff is that you really see it on the assembly side. The assembly is really stretched thin when it comes to staff and almost over-relying on interns to help them get ready. And where the Senate side, the Senate is heavily staffed, and you can see the capacity to do more, to engage more. It makes a huge difference in collaboration. And I'll hands down choose working with the senator because they offer more capacity. And when you work with an assembly member, you're basically opting to do the work for them because they just don't have the staff capacity to engage. I think the other part is we have 2-year election cycles, which means people are constantly running and constantly fundraising. And so not always spending as much time getting to the meat and potatoes of the job, which is learning how to budget.
Thanks. So, any other question? Again, I'm going to come back to what I started with. If you could change one thing, EJ, what would you change?
That question.
If you could do one thing question is always difficult. So I don't know whether I mean this or not. I guess, frankly, the thing that would be the biggest bomb into the situation, because again, notwithstanding the really practical ideas I think CBC has offered that would actually could be very realistic in the short term, as people in accountancy. But probably changing the fiscal year would be a fairly significant. And I think that the other problems associated with it are easy to get around compared to how fundamentally it would change the system. Otherwise, it's the thing that is most likely to make legislators rethink the way they've been approaching this, possibly. I'll just throw that out. I didn't think about it enough, maybe, but that's that.
I like EJ's suggestion. I think that's a good one. I like CBC's report. But I would go with the independent budget office idea, however it gets structured, CBO like or IBO like. We need more independent watchdogs, not fewer. And to the extent that it's professionalized and its funding is protected, that's the key thing. The problem means it had to be created constitutionally. I think that would make a big difference.
I'm going to go in a completely different lane and say campaign finance reform. If we get big money out of politics, then we'll have more engagement with everyday New Yorkers, and they can be more part of the process because legislators will prioritize their voters over the big money.
I think I already mentioned the ABO and support for the IBO, but if I could just put a little more, put some flowers or, decoration on Jasmine's point about campaign finance reform. I think a part of that, we're going to have a public matching system soon. That's going to do a lot to change, I think, the type of people who can run for office. But pay to play reform, doing business restrictions, that's a huge issue. There's so many other states that do it, and New York City does it, where people who are doing business with government cannot make contributions. They're either ineligible for contracts or they are limited in what they can give. This has been in place in New York City for quite some time. I am a registered lobbyist. I cannot give more than $250 myself. So, this is a really important aspect of campaign finance reform because we know there are a lot of campaign contributions coming to the committee chairs, coming to the governor from people who directly are doing business and seeking to influence state government.
Yeah, I think it's that. Add an exclamation point to that. I mean, I think it's a very hard thing to put together because, as you all know, thanks to the U.S. Supreme Court, in a number of areas, this being one of them, it's very hard to sort of figure out how you can restrict campaign finances, the campaign contributions influence on the policy. But you could do pay to play stuff. There's no constitutional right to a government contract, even though some people may think that. So there is ways to do it. The money game becomes pretty tricky. There are political committees all over the place. How do you restrict the money that goes to the Nassau County Democratic Committee that then gets transferred up to the State Democratic Committee to deal with a contract before the health department, right? I mean, you can sort of figure there are ways to do it. States have tackled it. I totally agree with Rachel. And I think that this is a legitimate issue that lawmakers could deal with this year without having to worry about running afoul of Supreme Court restrictions.
And on my one recommendation, I think it would be all 12 of these again, but I will add a couple of reasons for kind of our optimism in writing the report and having the event, one of which is that we've seen progress on several of these over the last year and a half already. Not only the reporting stuff, but building the rainy day fund, making the rainy day fund bigger overall will change. Like EJ was saying, we haven't had a real fiscal crisis, like prolonged fiscal crisis on the revenue side in a little bit, but it will be an entirely different ballgame with currently $10 billion compared to the $2 billion that we had coming into the last recession. That already changes the landscape. So optimistic that things have already been done in the last year and a half. And the other is that several of these actions, things that are on the paper and things that we've discussed kind of on this panel are just publishing work that's already done. We've talked about how great and professional the staff at DOB and in the fiscal committees are. A lot of this is just publishing the good work that they do and is available, making it public. They're not, I don't think anybody in those entities is looking for something else to do. They're not bored, especially this time of year. But some of these actions are just putting out what they're already doing.
And can I make one point that I think really illustrates the problem we have in New York? Just to remind folks about the Buffalo billions for the stadium. And whether you agree with that was a good investment or not, it's not the point. This was $1 billion that was not in the executive. It was not in either one house. Yet we managed to put $1 billion in the enacted budget for a stadium. And that just shows the opaqueness of the process. We're talking about big dollars here. This is New York State. This is one of the wealthiest states in the country, one of the wealthiest places in the world. And we move money around, big dollars around so casually without real engagement, without real accountability. And we have to demand better and we have to do better.
Well,
Jasmine, I'll go one better. How expensive was the Micron deal?
I don't even know.
Well, that was
Like $5 billion.
the green
the good
chips.
news is it may not happen. So.
The green chips tax credit didn't even happen during the budget process. It happened in June. So yes, that was not even during the budget process when our governor has been vetoing a lot of bills saying that they have a fiscal impact. Somehow that one went through, even though it wasn't during the regular budget process.
The
$10
question on
billion
the
worth of
question on
tax
those
credits.
things is, why did the legislature do that? That's my question.
It's both the executive.
Oh, no, it's
Why did either
ultimately,
one of them do it?
she could not have done that without them. They did it, and then they all ran around and said, oh my gosh, this is horrible. Can you believe it?
Well,
And she made us do it.
Well,
a
they
ref-
couldn't have done it if she hadn't done it, right? I mean, so let's
Sure,
let the
okay.
executive off.
Yeah.
my biggest reform that I would do to state government is, if you're going to do refundable tax credits, you got to appropriate them.
That's a great idea.
And it would get us away from some of this stuff where people would actually have to see it as part of the budget. Because I do listen, again, I've done this stuff for 40 years, so I have seen it. But, when we went down the road of refundable budget, tax credits, we actually even went further than all of the problems everyone on this panel mentioned today. No one sees it at all.
Well, in the tax expenditure report, thanks to Frank Morrow, we at least have that,
But not even really.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I think there's a perception that somehow tax expenditures, tax credits are free money. That, oh, well, it's not part of the budget, so therefore it doesn't matter. It doesn't have that fiscal impact. But obviously it does, because that is, billions of dollars that could go to other things, could go to education, could go to, so many other different things. And I think, we have seen a little bit of progress. We now have a database of deals that gets a look at some of those tax credit programs. But, if we're going to have them, if they do exist, we at least need to evaluate whether they're working or not. I know that Blair mentioned sort of performance management. So, it's another layer of that tax expenditure piece is just making sure if we're going to be spending this money, because it really is spending money, it's not free money, then we need to know it's actually working.
Final comments from folks?
Thank you, CBC.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
you.
Right.
And of course, Bob.
Thank you all.
That was good.
I know, it's good to see everyone outside. So thanks everyone for coming. Thanks for our first panel, which was fantastic. I took all my notes. I just talked to Brother Friedfeld here about how everyone wants his members to do more. So that was the outsiders. So now we're going to have the insiders. We have a group of people here who've all sat in seats, representing those three parties who negotiate the budget. There's discussion about how it used to be 3 men and how now it's not 3 men, and how there's always going to be some negotiation behind closed doors because it's hard to make compromises in public, which is some of the nature of the beast. And there's nothing that demands more compromises at times than budgets, as you all know. So we are fortunate to have 3 people. I'm going to do brief introductions and then launch into it, if that's okay. I won't go through everyone's history because they're varied and deep, but we have Dave Friedfeld, who's now Secretary of the New York State Senate Finance Committee for the last couple of years. This is your 3rd budget in this position you're about to start. He, of course, has an esteemed career that included 5 years before that as Director of State Studies at the Citizens Budget Commission. He knows the local government view by being Albany County Commissioner of Management and Budget. He was 4 years, I think, working for Dean at the Assembly staff and a little over a year at DOB. So you sat in a lot of seats there, can bring that perspective. Dean, not only Dave's boss, which of course is the most important part, but he's a small club that has been deeply ensconced, not only in the state budget, but the city budget, a club of 4 or 5 people who really stand out in their service and knows the difference. So he brings that to the table. He was over 20 years in the Assembly, rising to the Secretary of Program and Policy and Secretary of Ways and Means. I think you were double secretary at one point. You were slightly outside as EVP of SUNY Poly, but in New York City, you were 4 years. We first met, actually. You're 4 years as the budget director and then 4 years as the first deputy mayor, so understood those seats well. And now you're at the CUNY Institute for State and Local Governance, bringing a little expertise to that position, I see. And Mary Beth LeBate, who I think has been in this business for 30 years, if I got it now Brown Weinraub. You were semi-outside as president of the Commission on Independent Colleges and Universities. Previously, before that, you were senior advisor to SUNY Chancellor for Fiscal Policy. But I think, am I correct, 23 years in DOB? Starting under Mario Cuomo, wearing a lot of different hats, culminating under Andrew Cuomo as first deputy and then budget director. So you sat in a lot of seats there, and you have an agency view, if I got this right, at DHCR and Parks, and H might have meant housing before homes, if I know my history, because we seem to have a history thing. So we are so fortunate to have great expertise here. I want to jump right into it with kind of a lightning round-ish, and because we're in Albany, we'll call it a quick start. So what is the single biggest problem with the budget and fiscal management process? And what would be the one thing that you would change about that process to improve it at all? And it might not be about your single biggest problem. You might say, hey, I can't solve that problem, but here's what I can solve. So the single biggest problem and the one thing you would change if you had what Blair Horner before called the magic wand. Let's turn to Dave Friedfeld.
Thanks, thank you, Andrew, and thanks for having me today. So, I not to kind of avoid the question completely, but to start
Only partially.
Only partially. I think that while there certainly could be improvements, I do think that we have done a lot of really good things in the budget process, whether it be foundation aid, pre-K, UPK, all these kinds of things that we have done. But I think if we were to do one thing, particularly from the legislative side, it would be to kind of restore things to where they were pre-Silver Reef attacking. I don't know if that takes the form of a constitutional amendment or whatever that would exactly look like, but I think the outsized executive power, not in presenting the budget, but in the negotiating process, creates problems that I think that could be alleviated if we had more of that ability to go with what we'd call a two-way budget back then, if necessary, without the threat of kind of the outsized executive. And that's not to say that.
And is there a specific, like, you want to be able to edit the appropriations to do
Yeah,
X or?
that's really what it comes down to, that if we needed to, that we could edit the appropriations. And that's not to say that we haven't negotiated lots of good things, like I said, all the stuff that we have gotten, beyond what was in the executive budget. But I think that would make for a fair, and in many ways, address some of the issues that were discussed in your pipeline.
Mary Beth?
I'd say the biggest problem is actually a practical one, and I did hold the bond, and I still couldn't figure out how to do it. And it was just, there was a really intense crunch period for getting it done. And I don't know if in that, pulling 2-3 weeks of all-nighters always brings the best thinking to the table. So people have talked about all sorts of ways of adjusting that. I just think it's the nature of the beast that when you're negotiating and creating postures and you're trying to get where you want to be, you're going to wait till the last minute to get the very best deal you can get. But that process is moving. That process might not always bring optimal results, just because for the sheer fact, does anyone do their best thinking at 3 a.m.? I don't know.
So that's the biggest problem.
I think it's a big problem.
and do you have
Because
a-
I will say, I'll start with you. I've been involved in creating a budget for a long time. I think it's fundamentally a strong process. I think there's lots of just pure metrics that sort of suggest that.
And we'll come back to that with a second round of questions. And what's the one thing you would change? And you, as you said, you don't know exactly, because people by nature are semi-procrastinators or whatever. What would you change, which may or may not address that? What's the one thing you would like to change?
I'd probably, for that particular issue, I'd probably encourage the executive to get the budget out a little earlier. Because I think to some extent, the budget division is an audience of one. We have to make sure the governor is supportive of what we're doing. And we have to make sure we represent the governor well with the constituency. But the legislature has multiple parties they have to. The legislature has to be happy with the budget. The members have to be satisfied that they're getting what they need. And I think by nature, their process is a little more challenging in that respect. So they probably need a little more time to deliberate than the executive does.
And,
Maybe do it.
and part of that challenge is people's nature. One of the challenges CBC has always had is, if you give more time, does it help? Or do people then just shift that 3 weeks? So we'll come back to that, Dean.
So I'm gonna
Now you're
avoid it.
thinking about the other things they said. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to avoid it just for a minute and just sort of set the frame. We're talking about this. It's actually unusual at this point in time to be talking about budget reforms. Although we've been talking about these for easily 30 years, these kind of reforms, some of which have happened. But normally these come out of two situations, right? A fiscal crisis, which we're not in at the moment, or there's been a huge shift in the power dynamics, which Dave talked about, which happened with the introduction of really non-traditional budget items into the budget, our attempt to remove them unsuccessfully in a horrible Court of Appeals decision that fundamentally weakened the legislative. But so we don't have that dynamic right now. And it's sort of amazing, both Mary Beth and Dave both said it, the budget's actually in a very strong place right now. We have reserves I've never envisioned that I would ever see in the state of New York. The budget's been timely, having done budgets that went into the summer, it's quite remarkable. The forecasts are pretty cautious and pretty good. So it's an unusual time to talk about that. But on the horizon, there are always going to be risks. And we know there are risks that are not actually being dealt with right now. The MTA is a huge risk. We are all living, there are many institutions, including our local governments, our school districts, SUNY, CUNY, and the MTA living on federal funds that are going to be ending over the next 2 years. That is going to create, that presents risks, and we should be trying to address those. So in that context, having come from the city, I do think understanding risk, understanding the financial plan, building the reserves, having gap budgeting, having general accepted accounting principles that still works for an executive. City executive was very strong. as is. I mean, no matter what happened and what reforms the state were to do to address Silver v. Pataki, it would not fundamentally change this being a strong executive state and a strong executive budget. So I do believe your attempts to talk about how we account for things and how we present problems, that would be a dramatic change that would actually be very helpful, and as well as building reserves. You only gave me one, but I'll do two. I do think there's an imbalance in the legislative executive relationship that needs to be addressed. I think part of the reason things were successful last year, the legislature was successful in removing a huge amount of what we would traditionally call non-budget items from the budget, and that actually helps the process. But it's it depends on the personalities and the annual negotiations, and the time is too short. I've worked on both systems now at the state and city level, and I appeared before the city council 4 times in the budget cycle. Budget director never appears. It never happens, and it's such a compressed period of time. I don't understand how it's possible to avoid what Mary Beth talked about at the end, which is it just gets compressed into a few weeks of all-nighters, and that's not what happens in the city. And I do think there's something to be learned. So I'm sorry I gave you 3.
No, listen, it's all good stuff, and we're just kicking off panel. Quick question. So Mary Beth, you never testified when you were budget director.
No,
And is that a structural problem or a cultural problem?
Yeah, cultural. I don't know. I don't think there's any reason why.
So
you couldn't
I ask it, it's a loaded question, I confess. But I ask it because that's part of the issues, are there structural solutions to cultural problems, and are there cultural problems? But that's the, but understand that, Dave, let's go back, delve a little deeper, and I'm reflecting on the first panel. There's majority and minority. EJ was here. He used to be a minority Ways and Meanser. There you have a diverse, even within the conference, very, very diverse constituency. But then Jasmine, the first panel, was talking about whether legislators had the information. So that's in Patrick's report. There's fundamentally the question of, is there the right and enough information had and enough time, as we've talked about a little, to do this? Because there are late breakers, stadium, and then there are non-budget. There's the Micron deal. There's stuff outside the budget, and Bob Magno wins my award for a thing that not in our report that was there, appropriating tax expenditures for he wins. So there are late breakers, lump sums, stuff not in the budget, and then there are things that were within kind of the budget timeframe, like some of the sweetener bills that don't have fiscal notes that have fiscal impacts. And then of course there's the messages of necessity. There's at least one bill in the last 9 years that have been pushed through. Would having more of that information and that time without the message of necessity, would that help the legislature and individual rank and file legislators do their job more fully and help contribute to better budgeting?
Okay, so I'm gonna try to address all those things. I count 9 things you just listed. So very quickly.
One for each message of necessity.
Actually, I don't think we needed 9 because the legislative budget didn't need one, or debt service. But so regarding the message of necessity, so I actually did some research on this after I looked at your report. I can only find a couple of states that actually have an aging requirement for budgets. The federal government doesn't have one, the city doesn't have one as far as I know. So it's kind of this thing where we happen to have this rule, which we have the legal ability to notwithstand. So we do notwithstand it sometimes. And suddenly it seems like it's a problem when nobody else has to do it anyway. So I actually don't think the message of necessity is that big of a deal. As far as getting information to the members, I can speak more comfortably about the Senate because doing it now as opposed to December where it was before. We update our members all the time. Now, does every single member get an update on every single detail? Probably not. But we have conferences every day during budget, hours-long conferences. And it's actually one of the nice things about living in a Zoom world now. We can do those even when folks are not in Albany. It used to be members had to come up to Albany to get briefed on everything. Now we can do a Zoom on a Saturday night. Members are back in their districts. We can update them on what's going on. So certainly from the Senate's perspective, I'm not saying it's in comparison to the assembly, it's just what I feel more comfortable talking about. We update our members a lot. Now, I don't think you can reasonably expect to update every single member, and again, speaking of the majority, I should say, on every single detail, because there's so many details, regardless of how long the budget negotiation process is. But certainly anything important we bring to the whole conference, the leader, the chairs, to make sure that they're informed. So I think that they are more informed than I think some folks might think. As far as
But why do you think people feel that or hear that from members they're talking to? What is that dynamic about?
So sometimes, these conferences will be 5 hours long, and we'll be going through incredibly dense information, and it's up on the screen, and we go through it. And people are human; they get up, they go through. They phase out for a little bit. They, not gonna say they drift off to sleep, but it's late at night. Like sometimes people miss things, or they don't understand that the thing that lobbyists or a constituent was talking to them about is the program that we're talking about, because they call it something different. Have a lot of complex names. There's a lot of complex things, and sometimes you just don't necessarily understand the implications. And that's certainly not meant to be a criticism of the members. I mean, look at the city council this past year, where they voted on the school budget and they didn't realize that it was going to cut to their districts. Now, they were my understanding is that they could have known that. I don't know. I wasn't in the room, but so I think sometimes people are told things, don't necessarily understand the implication. So I'm not 100% sure on that perception. And I also don't know, sometimes people could say that they, weren't aware of something because maybe they didn't know, but it's more comfortable to say that they weren't aware.
More comfortable to say that they weren't aware. And it is complicated. Listen, many of us have been in our professional lives trying to explain these fiscal issues to people, and some people might be more inclined to listen and pay attention and understand them, and it's more challenge for others. People come to public service from a lot of different backgrounds. Mary Beth, what was your thoughts about that, sitting from the executive side? I saw you thinking as Dave was talking.
I think that clearly staff understood. Staffs in both houses understood that budget, had information. I think maybe we could have been a little more forthcoming in making the information more readily available at certain times. And my experience has always been there was that members are never going to know everything. It's a $200 billion budget now. And just the president, the CEO of GE does not know everything in their financial plan. But my experience was that the staff is critical to getting the information out to members. And I didn't really feel that members were ever performing in a vacuum or voting in a vacuum. But if the threshold is I didn't know this particular item, that's not surprising.
You have to be reasonable about that.
Things, right?
So Dean, you went from the state to the city, a different world. As you were saying, we're having, CBC wanted to do this work now because it is so important. It sometimes gets done, like, improvements to the rainy day fund, as Patrick mentioned last year. Good stuff happens. It should go further. Good stuff happens. But we all know that we'll be in some crisis again and saying, we really should have done that when the times were good, types of things. So we're taking the shot. But you went from the state to the city, and there were you were in a different structural and cultural world, which obviously was designed after the fiscal crisis. And so gap balance, gap budgeting, management, for your financial plans, quarterly updates, a financial control board, which doesn't have the power that it used to be. New York City having an independent budget office, thanks to the charter reform of '89, which of course wasn't funded until '96 because the executive didn't want to. But a couple of court cases later. What could you not do in New York City that you could have done in Albany, and was that a good or a bad thing?
So there are many things there, right? I mean, so the city budget is under generally accepted accounting principles. You end up working with accountants, which I know sounds strange, but in
Accountants in budgeting?
But you actually have to be careful about how you're making a decision. One of the very first things we did was a huge labor deal, and we ended up in like a 6-week fight over how that was going to be accounted for. That doesn't happen and a cash budget. And a cash budget, and you said it in your report, you gave the example, you gave the Medicaid example. I mean, it's too easy to move across the fiscal year problems or actual surpluses. It's too easy to manipulate that, and you don't have that option. It doesn't mean that the city budget director doesn't have huge powers and the mayor doesn't have huge powers that they can use. But it is more constrained, and it does tell you, it gives a clear, fair picture on a consistent set of standards that don't change with budget directors and governors, but continually is there, what your problems are, what you're confronting, and how you're going to deal with this. The other piece of it, it's an ongoing process. It is a constant budget process in the city. It is literally updated 4 times a year, potentially with the council acting 4 times a year. So there's a much more of a continuous dialogue that doesn't happen. It's very, and I'm going to guess that the day this hasn't changed, there's always a frustration once you enact a budget. Is it happening? Is the implementation occurring? There's no formal process that forces that. And in the city, you have that. So the ongoing process constrains you differently. Understanding the rules of budgeting is night and day. And those things I do think are beneficial. And I don't think they actually weaken the executive budget.
And when you said, just so I'm clear, when you said the implementation, obviously matters, and arguably the executive, that's where a lot of the real power is. Because plenty of times the budget offices can stop people from spending money. But when you say that, was it the quarterly update process monitors that implementation, or what were you referring to specifically?
It's
that it was more actively?
What is the ongoing? It's the ongoing quarterly process. It's the constant dialogue with the council. It's the potential need for modifications that happen.
Mm-hmm.
You don't really modify the state budget except for the adopted budget. It can happen, but it's really unusual. It's normally crisis driven. That creates a different dynamic, and I actually think it enhances the council's power. And the other piece you said, I mean, their oversight entities all came out of the fiscal crisis. There's no comparison.
And is that good?
Yeah, I do think it's good. And look, everybody who submits a budget, you said it in the beginning, it's opaque in your report. Of course, they're like it's $220 billion. It's going to be difficult to understand, but we don't make it easy. And we don't make it easy for the public. We don't make it easy for the legislature. We don't make it easy. And because there's so many other pressures happening. It's not necessarily always malicious. It's just the way it comes out. And that's another problem, I think, with a very short time frame.
And so, Mary Beth, specifically 2 things, I think. You said 3 things. You said more. But using GAP, having a quarterly modification process. We do quarterly updates in the state. It's improvement of the old days. I just want to remind people. But there's that, and there are plenty of people, and there's a lot of discussion, a little different. Jasmine mentioned in the first. It's about the people who have power like the system, and it works kind of well for them. So what are the obstacles for changing, whether it be the fiscal year, gap balance budgeting, quarterly modifications? What are the structural obstacles to change, and how would those be addressed?
Well, I guess I don't know if there are structural obstacles as much as, it can certainly happen, but I guess I wonder whether so much of the process is driven by, frankly, the leadership. If they want a process that is opaque, they're going to get a process that is particularly opaque. If they want something that's very forthcoming, they're going to get something that's particularly forthcoming. And I think we've seen that with various executives. So I guess, I've been around, we've seen every reform possible, but at the end of the day, the reform isn't worth the ink it's written in unless there is some will to really open up the process more than it is. GAP, the rating agencies, never heard the rating agencies talk about GAP. And frankly, I'm pretty surprised that that there isn't more manipulation because we're in a cash basis. I mean, I think the Medicaid role, that was more of a function, not because we were running out of money. That was a function of someone wanted to maintain an arbitrary cap and wanted to hold to that cap. But I don't think I don't think GAP is an elixir of any sort for the state budget process. What I do think is, these gentlemen have talked a lot about the power of the executive, and I absolutely agree that it's the budget is structured, the Constitution is structured to give the executive a stronger hand. I think what goes unsaid, and I see some of my friends in the budget division out there, but I helped to create this, so I'm not criticizing it. But during implementation, the executive has incredible power. So you can have every appropriation that you want out there, and if the executive decides they're not going to spend it, you can always bring up Oneida v. Burley, which says you have to spend local assistance. But there is a whole host of appropriations that may never get out the door because, for one reason or another, we didn't really want to do it to begin with. We're mad at this person, this, that. I think that doesn't happen as much anymore. It used to happen. But that's, I think, where if I were in their seat, I would be particularly frustrated with that they fought hard to get certain things in the budget. The executive has a lot of influence on whether those things happen.
Let's break that down into two pieces. One is we amazingly are spending around 220 billion, yet we appropriate around 800 billion. Should that be like that? Dave, I mean, Bob talked about 2 years, and there's capital 2 years, but what happens at times that we've seen people take credit, advocates will look at the budget and say, hey, the program's there, and that is opaque because people are confused about what is actually in that financial plan because the only details of that for some things are in the appropriations which don't cross well. So let's first take that, and then let's go to the kind of legislative oversight and performance management piece. But Dave, what do you think of that?
So I think to kind of tie that to GAP, no states do GAP. And I did GAP or modified GAP when I was at the county. And you just argued over different things about how to display things. There was I remember we received a payment. I'm laughing because one of my successors is in the back, and he'll remember this. We received a payment from the federal government for our nursing home, and it was after a year had closed, and we got into this big fight with the comptroller about what year to put it into, and there were claims about what years were closed and all this kind of stuff. So you have similar fights, and then that year was used as the example of how the nursing home can be run and all these kinds of things when we were trying to initiate some significant reforms. So I think the benefit of GAP may be overstated because I think to what Mary Beth said, where you have the personalities can have a huge impact on how things get presented. I know CBC has historically calculated the actual growth rate of the city budget because of the retiree, I forgot what it was, retiree something, how they used the retiree account.
There were a lot of pieces, including GAP accepted roles.
Correct.
It's just more transparent. Like we didn't have to find it on page 733 of the enacted budget report when they usually talk about the role somewhere else. One of our former staff's like, oh well, I didn't see it day one because they you can hide things.
Yes. So I certainly see some of the benefits there, but I also think that some of the personalities has an impact. As far as the appropriations line for the financial plan, state ops is one of the areas where you have a big delta between what is appropriated versus what's expected to be spent. But that is the state operations. It's the expectation that the executive is going to manage that because they have the desire and the willingness to kind of curb that spending a bit. And then on the local aid side, things are much closer. As far as the $800 billion number, does that include reappropriations?
Yes.
Okay, so I mean, to me, that's kind of like if you're paying enough attention to the budget to care about the 800 billion versus the 220 billion, you understand what a reappropriation is and what is happening as far as you needing to say, this $100 million wasn't completely spent down, so we're going to keep that spending in the budget so that it can continue to be spent down.
With what money?
That's the difference between the financial plan versus the appropriation. We also don't do a bill on how much revenue we're going to have, right? I mean, we don't vote on that. That's not something that's agreed to. It's similar to the financial.
So from the point of view, the fact that the appropriations you have legal authority to spend much more than you actually have money is not the problem, since the executive is going to take care of that. I'm just trying to understand it.
Yeah, largely, and not only is there's an agreement to do that, but the areas where the executive is going to spend basically up to that appropriation is outside of the state's agency operations. So if the executive decides that Department X doesn't need that full 100 million, they only need 80 million because they spent 75 million the year before. I don't, at least for the legislature, I consider that
That's not a problem. I mean, advocates have often brought it up because at times they've looked at the appropriations, think there's a program that's actually not there. And there have been times historically legislators have said, look what I got in the budget for something that's not there. Misunderstanding, misintention, I'm not, I'm sure it's the gamut over history. Now, in terms of the executive's power in execution, one of the things in our report talked about performance management before, talked about the SAGE Commission, and I know we talked a little, Mary Beth, so we'll come back to you. But from the legislators' point of view, part of it is that oversight of the budget. From the legislature's point of view, does the executive have too much power as it's executing the budget, and whether performance management or oversight hearings could do a better job at fulfilling more of a substantial role from the counterbalance point of view?
Those three.
Yes.
I was listening.
I know you were. I was looking. I was intent.
So, I mean, I think performance management would be great. I remember when we released that report, I said, I don't think we should do it because Cuomo's not going to institute a, performance management report at the time, and he's going to be governor forever. So I was clearly wrong there. But I do think there would be a benefit. It's something that I know that our members would like to see because, we fight hard for the money that we get in the budget, particularly, over and above what's in the executive budget. And we want to know that that money is being well spent. And that's one of the, the issues that we faced where we don't want to waste money. We want it to go to programs that are effective, that are worthwhile. And so I think a real performance management system would be very helpful, recognizing that it is hard for the executive, particularly to implement a system that may not be complementary of some of the programs they've implemented.
There has been a bill, and I don't know if it was reintroduced last session, to institute a performance management. Is the legislature, what's the momentum in moving on that bill? I mean, you can't predict the future, but that's still out there, or will be introduced, or you don't know?
Bills were introduced like yesterday, so I don't know.
Okay,
Andrew
that's okay.
would like you to sign off right now.
No. Yeah. Look, as you said, the executive has to do something, but the legislature has a role, and there is the bill. Mary Beth, what's your thoughts since you raised the thing, and then we'll go to the man who actually produced the mayor's management report. So we'll see what he says.
I think there are some things that are really easy to measure. How long does it take you when you go to DMV? How long does it take to get your tax rebate? Then there are other things that you can measure them, but when the results don't come back the way you would deem as being a successful program, then what's next, right? So we've never spent more money than we're spending now on homelessness. Homelessness continues to be exacerbated. I think it will tell you where your deficiencies are. It doesn't necessarily tell you the next step to address those. So in the private sector, maybe when you've spent a lot of money on something and it's not working, you say, we're no longer going to spend money on that. In the public sector, you say, do you just say, I'm going to spend more money on it? Or do you say, we need to take a different approach? So I think that's the challenge of a performance management system. What do you do when the metrics aren't bearing out all the investment that you're putting in?
And does this get back to what we talked about in terms of the barriers to change? Because what Dave said and what you just said is you said two parts of that. One is it doesn't give you the answer. The other, implicit, you didn't say this, implicit is like, well, people don't want the bad news. Is that a barrier to actually implementing? I would argue from the public transparency point of view, let's get it out there and let's try to fix stuff.
Yeah, no, I think regardless of whether they want the bad news, I think it's valuable to have good metrics then, but I think the much bigger challenge is what do you do when you're realizing that your investment isn't bringing you where you need to be.
Dean.
It's a great tool. I mean, I would live in terror of the thing coming out and knowing that that there are going to be some good things, but no one was going to focus on that. They were going to focus on the problems, but it does focus your attention. It makes an executive, okay, I've got problems where I may not have been looking. I mean, everybody knows what's happening with homeless, but there are a lot of other programs out there that you may not have been looking at and may not have focused at, and it wasn't you didn't have that attention, and all of a sudden it's in front of you. And sometimes it is fixed, and you can do it. Sometimes it does involve working with the city council and the legislature. I think it's a really helpful tool. I don't understand. Actually, I don't think there can be a policy argument for not doing it. Hopefully it's done effectively by the executive, and yeah, it's going to give them some pause, and it's going to give them a hard time explaining some things. That's one of the benefits. It also tells you what things are working well, and you as an executive, you point to those and say, okay, but we also have all these things that the metrics are working.
Dean, do you think it's am I allowed to ask questions?
Oh, yeah.
Do you think it's a little, is it different because the city is so involved in direct delivery of
Yeah.
services?
I do think no question, the local governments, it really does work because we are delivering services. It may have a different form, but there is something at the state level to say that metrics would be a good thing.
And yes, my experience in implementing one in the public health department in New York City, a performance management system, where some stuff we have SDE clinics, cycle time and whatever. Then you look at the outcomes on SDE. Some are more distal, and you come up with different metrics and you figure it out. I will say, when I was doing this in the city, someone came to one of our quarterly meetings, and they basically said, for 3 years we've done this program. It hasn't had an effect because now we were looking at the data, so we're going to double it. And after the meeting, we closed it because, frankly, we had stuff we could do with the money. And that's the kind of thing. Dave, do you think if there was such a system that the legislature would want to allocate resources differently and say, this isn't working, this is working, why don't we shift stuff? Or do you think it wouldn't have that power?
No, I think it definitely would. I think there would be. I think it could be very helpful in decision making. That being said, certainly, our members are on the ground. They're in their communities. They know, they have a very strong sense of what programs I think are working and what are not working. But that could be an issue of something's not working in neighborhood X, but it actually is working statewide. So it's really an issue with whatever is being provided in a certain spot. And there is also kind of that issue where we are in many ways for many programs we're a pass-through. Providing record education aid is great, but then we give it to a school district to then implement. So I think it'd be interesting in crafting a system whether or not you would be looking at outcomes at a local level where it's using largely state funding, or if it would just be state implemented programs. And I think that could have an impact because, like we've talked about before, 2/3 of the state government is Medicaid and education, which we don't really, we provide the funding, we don't provide the service.
I do think it's very different when you're directly providing a service. We should know how much does it cost us to pave a mile of highway. That's a direct state responsibility. What are our metrics in docs where we are administering that? I do think it gets a little dicier when we are a pass-through, and New York City might be doing something great. Buffalo might be doing a lot differently, but I think maybe start with baby steps and commit to an honest assessment of the services that the state directly delivers.
I will challenge that, if I may, following my predecessor, Bob's role of interventional moderation. One of the things we've said is, as we fully funded foundation aid, over time, and we got, 13 billion, 11 of which is federal aid is going to the schools, we could sit back 3 years from now, or 2 years, we're getting to the end of that, time flying. We could sit back and say, oh, wow, learning didn't really accelerate, disparities weren't really reduced. It seems even though you're not delivering the service on the ground, seems like an important thing, because the answer will generally be, then we have to spend more on it. And there will be multiple cycles of this. And there was a wonderful oversight hearing of the state of, like, last year, 2 years ago, about what's happening in different districts. But literally every district's doing a different thing and saying it's going to be good. And I was watching that, scratching my head saying, I don't have that confidence because yes, it'll be different. Dean, can I ask you, going back to something, Dave basically said, well, GAP's not going to really matter that much and no one uses it anyway, except for New York City. And he's right on that latter point. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Look, I mean, Bob said it before. I mean, the city was approaching bankruptcy. The state and federal government had to step in, and all these reforms occurred. And so these are not natural things that budget offices want to do or would do. I'll go back to it doesn't mean that an executive still doesn't have tremendous power to manage a budget. It's just a consistent set of guidelines on how you actually not just account, but you actually budget. And it really does give you a very clear picture of how much money you have into the future and what your gaps really are. And that's a big deal. And I just think it's helpful.
You think
it's not a magic wand, right? It's not going to, it doesn't tell you that you're going to address that problem. You still need decision making. You still need the legislature to negotiate with the governor, and you still need the fiscal committees and DOB to have that relationship and negotiate. It doesn't change all that, but it does say, okay, there's a part of the manipulations you can't do, and we're going to all have a better understanding of what the future is. So that's a benefit.
One of the things in the report also proposes is that there should be basic financial plan statements when in the one house bills and when the budget is enacted. In New York City, there's, we got a basic financial plan. It's a couple of tables, within 12 hours or whatever the handshake is. Used to be ice cream up in Albany. I don't know what's happening these days. Just trying to keep on the historical aging thing. Mary Beth, could that actually be produced? Is there an obstacle to actually having a basic financial plan when the budget agreement happens? You've sat in that seat.
You can get you can get pretty close because you can't really sign off on a budget without knowing that you're in the ballpark of
Well,
your revenues and your spending.
Us outside who think
yeah.
about these things are a little
Yeah.
worried when there's
No,
like
no.
a press release that says it's going to be 220 billion, and then 30 days later, 222, and there's no state operation fund and
Yeah.
whatever.
No,
But-
I think you certainly don't know executive, and I think legislature would agree on the budget without having a pretty close understanding of what the resulting spending and revenues will be.
I mean, is there an internal table that we don't see, but there is one that you guys talk about?
I used to call Dom Califati and say, can we afford to do what we're doing? And he'd say yes or no, and I'd say, okay, let's go.
So I would say that there is an internal table. It's not as detailed as a financial plan. It makes sure everything balances. Do we know definitively whether something is going to be out of the general revenue fund or a special revenue fund? That's the kind of stuff that gets kind of worked out by a DOB after the fact. We certainly make sure that it's balanced. And usually when there's a change from like 220 to 222, that's because the Fed's pumped in some money. Where it's a timing thing of when we're going to get federal money that's going to flow through. That's not an issue of really state decision making.
Right, although, that press release I was referring to actually had no state operating fund number in it, so I couldn't use that as an example. That was my challenge with that. Do you think, from the public's point of view, so we heard in the first panel, we generally heard, we don't have enough information, there's not enough good information. Everyone agrees that time is a problem, but there's not enough information. And then we sit outside and say, hold on, we have a one-house budgets without financial plans, we have enacted budgets, I don't even know what's happening. And someone's gonna ask me, I'm gonna look over there at Jimmy in the other room, he's gonna say, is the budget good? And I'm gonna say, it would be good with numbers. And we have that discussion. It sounds like the outsiders think it's unacceptable and the people who do it think the process is working pretty well. Which is it? Anyone? I don't mean to put you on the hook because you're sitting next to me.
No, I'm happy to, because to kind of go back to what I said when I started was that, the outcome of the budget process, I think certainly from the members of the New York State, the Democratic members of the New York State Senate, has been very positive in as far as funding the things that are important to us, as far as having record reserves, like you mentioned, something that was unthought of years ago, and it's a little more partisan, but we got back-to-back supermajorities for the first time ever, which says that certainly the public is not dissatisfied with what we're doing. Now I understand the seat that you sit in, as I sat below that, but previously.
Oh, you were with me every step.
In that it does make it harder for groups like Citizens Budget Commission and some of the folks who sat at the table previously. It may make it harder for them to do their job, which is to push certain policy objectives. But that's not the role of the legislature, isn't to help them achieve, and then they it's kind of a diaspora of things, and obviously have different levels of support within my conference. But the legislature's job isn't to help lobbyists get what they want. So it's true, a lobbyist might call, sorry for all of you in the room, and say, hey, what's going on with this thing? And you'll be told, I don't know, but it's not because the legislature, the members don't know, it's because we don't need you to know. That's not, our job isn't to tell you what, is everything is going on. So I think that's some of where some of the conversation may come.
But you have 12 recommendations, and there probably should be some priority to what? Both Dave and Mary Beth, on your point about the spread between appropriations and cash, were somewhat dismissive. I sort of agree. It's not, would it be nicer if it was more close? Sure. Is it necessary? No, because Dave's right, where it matters most on local assistance, it is very different. It is pretty close. I think there's another one. Mary Beth said it. DOB is not signing off on a budget without a financial plan.
Without what?
Without a financial plan. They know when they do that budget, they have a financial plan. It's not a public financial plan yet, but there's no way a budget director is signing off without a financial plan, or a secretary is. We all have these conversations. So could it be done before 30 days? Of course it could. Would it be a good thing? I think the answer is yes, it would be a good thing. Is it earth-shattering to the process? No, but would it be beneficial? Sure.
Yeah, I think that I think there is, we should draw the distinction between the process and the outcome. Because I think the outcome in New York spends a lot of money. We are a progressive state that prides itself in spending on important public policy initiatives. I think that's different than, I don't think that's the process that brings us there. It's the policy and the politics and frankly the values that bring us there, and by people who are elected. It's not that the budget doesn't drive you to spend money. I think any budget director, even if you're budgeting, but we pride ourselves in it. We're number one in spending on, how often do you see the lists? We don't shy away from it. We don't hide that.
One of the challenges always is in the long run, whether it be budget balance or infrastructure investment. Our roads and bridges, they're not in such good shape. These things aren't planned holistically, prioritized, and thought about in the same way as the operating budget of the day. Do you think that there are any improvements that can be made on the capital planning, infrastructure planning piece that would actually help within the process to maintain our infrastructure? Because as it gets older, not only do you have to kind of bring stuff, you have some fundamental repairs that need to happen. If you think about the MTA keeping up on the state of good repair, you think, but they have some fundamental 60-year life cycle things that are coming. What could we do to improve our capital planning and prioritization process, and why it's especially important right now? We have roads and bridges, but we're also going into an era appropriately of spending a lot on environmental mitigation and resiliency. And do we have the systems to do that well?
No one first last time.
I don't know if we have the best systems to prioritize, but when you look at where we put our capital money, it's in transportation. People might question how much we put into economic development, but it's economic development. That suggests we're at least know where it should go, but it's SUNY and CUNY, and I'm sure there's never enough, but we're putting it in the places where there are assets. I think the bigger question, and kind of getting maybe back to performance management is, does it cost a lot more to do things in New York State? And
Are we evaluating the cost effectiveness
Right.
of those
And why?
pieces? And that also goes back to the economic development piece that you alluded to. Dean?
I think you raised the right point. We spend a huge amount on capital. There are huge needs out there. You're right. You mentioned them. The roads and bridges, MTA, it's a huge amount that can't be funded. So there's got to be a prioritization on that. But how effectively we do it and can we improve on that? I think that's actually should be front and center.
And I think there is going to be a lot of money to implement the CLCPA, and where we get that funding from, I think is going to be, it's going to be, a major challenge and an opportunity. But I do think that there's going to be, we do have that other third rail, I guess, kind of coming in where there's going to have to be some significant investment.
Yeah, no, significant. So the one thing, so we have a few more minutes I want to ask. Mary Beth, what do you, because I've heard a little from Dean, and we'll get to Dave in a second. An independent budget office, a legislative budget office, would it help the process? There was a lot of discussion in the first panel about having someone who provides a more independent voice. It's challenging to structure everything when you're the chief executive of the state, but would it be helpful?
Well, I'm certainly going to sound like I'm the defender of the status quo through a lot of this, but speaking just for the budget division again, and from years past, it's a pretty non-political group. It's public servant, it's civil servants who've come up through the ranks. The numbers, we call the numbers like we see them. We have to. We're responsible at the end of the day for balancing the budget. There are other critics, and I don't say critics in a bad way, but there are others who oversee the budget. I see my friend Terry out there, the controller's office will take a look at the budget. Patty Warrington will used to keep us real honest on it. So I think there are other voices there, but maybe we would do things differently if we thought there was someone with a lot of teeth who would come in, but I can speak for the executive that
But
I don't
do-
think there was a lot of politics that went into the numbers, because numbers are numbers.
I do want to reiterate what people said in the first panel, and what I seriously, there are a lot of great professionals. And one of the things people, whenever they start to get into government and they get to know people, one of the things they all come to is like, hey, I didn't realize there were such smart, hardworking people here. We've all heard that. Like, people have talked to us, and those of us who work, we've heard that from out, and it's kind of insulting, but gratifying. There's the doing the work, and then there's the transparency. So I think the independent budget office concept is both. Dean, anything to reiterate about the IBO?
I'll start both at the state level and at the city level. The budget offices are incredibly professional, and in the legislature. So I think it's actually New York and the city are incredibly fortunate at the level of professionalism. It's not really going to challenge, an independent budget office is not going to challenge Mary Beth and what she was doing as budget director. It's not. But it is another place for elected officials to go to get a longer term perspective and a study. It was mentioned about the Penn Station redevelopment. That really requires that kind of office. And it adds to the discourse and to, okay, is this a good idea or not? It does add a benefit to it. The same kind of thing both the state and city controller provide. It's another place to go. It's a good thing. It's not a huge
Dave, you
expenditure.
convinced?
It's a good thing.
I mean, I think that there could be benefits. I think back to when I started in the assembly in 2004, we had a number of commissions that research like that. We had a tax study commission and a few other ones where I think that they did kind of some of that independent type research that wasn't necessarily tied to a specific bill or something like that. I'd be curious if an independent budget office, like exactly what they'd be looking at. One of the things that I was thinking about was, would they be doing bill analysis on individual bills? Would they be doing budget stuff? Because budget stuff moves very fast. That's partially because of the timeline we discussed before. And depending on where that accountability lied, and would they have, would it be kind of another voice like the comptroller's office that does, doesn't for the most part have a formal role in the budget as far as negotiations, or they would they be informational?
Or the question on CBO, would they score? You know, so that there actually is an independent fiscal on a multi-year basis. We see proposals all the time. Well, it's going to cost this much this year. Of course, what's the out years? You know, oh, there's no fiscal note, all those things. Last quick lightning round, quick start. We're going to have a quick finish, related but different. What's the one thing New York State should do in this budget cycle to help protect the future? I'll go for Dave last, so because he's actually involved this year, and so I'll give. What should happen this year to help protect the future? It can be a structural reform thing or a budget action.
I'll put on my budget director hat, put more in reserves.
And there's $2 billion that's actually sitting nowhere right now.
But
I mean,
they
sitting
put, I mean,
somewhere,
I'm
but, you know.
really impressed by what they've done with reserves.
Yes.
I think there's probably, if the financial plan remains strong, there's more to be done there.
Dean.
I think with the ending of the federal funds and the ramifications it has for the MTA, for SUNY, for CUNY, for school districts, that has to be front and center in the long-term plan. Not all of it's going to happen in this budget, but it's got to be part of the conversation.
You got to decide what programs exist or not and how they're going to fund them. Dave.
I was actually going to say something very similar to Dean, and that's for like making sure that we continue on the course that we are, preparing for a potential slow session. I was reading about yesterday, is the new term, where things are going to slow down considerably, but not actually go into a recession, and make sure we're able to continue to make the investments that we have promised we will, like fully funding foundation aid and continue to increase UPT.
Well, thanks to the three of you. And I just want to say to all of you who are watching, you're lucky that you have these three to listen to and have done great work. Thank you very much for participating today, and good luck with all the good work you all are doing your hats over the next few months, Dave.
Thank you.
Good morning again, everyone. I'm Greg David, and I've been covering fiscal issues in New York since 1985. Currently covering them for the nonprofit news site, The City, as well as teaching journalists how to cover budget issues through the Ravitch Fiscal Reporting Program at the Newmark J School. Yes, funded by Dick Ravitch, as is obvious. And we have trained more than 500 journalists in covering budgets, pensions, bonds, tax incentives, and whatever's timely at the moment. I have a group of 26 from around the country arriving on Monday for the next session. I am moderating this panel of journalists covering state budget issues, which includes Anna Gronwald of Politico, Rebecca Lewis of City and State, Dave Lombardo of WCNY, and Jimmy Bilkine of the Wall Street Journal. I'd like to begin with two comments. This conference began with the suggestion that the decline in media is part of the problem of transparency in budgets. I wonder about that, but I do have a question that we'll tackle later about it. And yes, given what was said before, I want to agree that a lot of coverage of governments and budgets is pretty bad. But I want to make a distinction that I heard this morning, in which the issue of the Buffalo Bills billion came up and the $5 billion for the Micron plant. I actually think journalists tried very hard to do well on the Buffalo billion. There just wasn't any information that allowed you to do well. And when the information was available, I thought there were very good comparisons and analysis because it's well-trodden ground about how much stadiums, incentives can be used for stadiums and how it happens. The Micron story is another one, and I was very unhappy that it was far from my turf because the coverage was abysmal. It violated every rule of tax incentive coverage that we teach, used all the wrong numbers, accepted the line from the governor without any criticism. And I thought that was perfectly appropriate. But I do think that that is an important distinction. So making things easier for myself, I'll ask each of the panelists in order to introduce themselves, give you a 3-sentence bio, and tell them how long they've been struggling with covering budget issues in Albany. Anna?
My name's Anna. I write a playbook for Politico, and I cover state politics in Albany. I've been doing that for about 5 years.
Rebecca, Brit City and State. I used to do first read, but after 5 years, got a break from waking up early in the morning. Sorry, Anna.
I want to say I read both of them, and they really keep me informed.
I cover state politics in Albany. I've been doing that for about 3 years.
Dave Lombardo, home cook, 3-time winner of the Greg Kubek Hustle Award, and host of the Capitol Press Room. I've been involved either covering or working inside on budget stuff for about 11 years now.
I'm Jimmy Bilkine. This is budget 15 started in 2009. For various news outlets.
So my first question is, tell me the one thing in your view that the powers that be in Albany do to make budget reporting difficult. Maybe the right word is impossible. But don't just echo the person that comes before. So I'll give Jimmy the easiest first crack at it, and then everyone else does have to add to the pie here.
Sure. Thank you, Greg. And also, I just want to underscore before I answer that, I am a graduate of the Ravitch Fiscal Reporting Seminar. It's about J School it's the little things that make life hard. So it's the notion of having the ability to ask questions of the budget director, but not having been able to view the relevant documents underpinning it before you can ask the questions. It's a question of just delaying things and releasing documents later in the day. I know that may seem like an immaterial gripe, and I'm aware that it is somewhat griping, but deadlines are real. Humans too. I like to think that there's a lot of kids many nights. So just the slow roll of information, kind of documents that are public, they are clearly public, and that they will be made public, can be frustrating and can be more of an hindrance than I think people realize. And it's not something to complain about because it's something that sounds
Dave?
So access to the DOB more broadly, I think is something that I would love to see. A lot of the time, aside from when the budget comes out, we don't get access to the budget director, and all of our questions get filtered to a comms person when DOB has a comms person, which is not the case as of like last week. And so I think they should be providing, say, staff who can give us background briefings throughout the process. Maybe they're not going to be quoted directly on the record, but can explain things to us all year round, and particularly January through March 31st.
I believe I talked to the Cuomo's budget director once outside of the post-budget briefing.
Did you like surprise them somewhere?
No, it was actually set up, but I was surprised to get it. Rebecca?
I am someone who loves policy probably a little bit more than finances, but the sheer amount of policy in the budget makes it much harder to really focus in on the part that makes it a budget, which is the money. So many, it's fun to cover, it's interesting to cover, but during the budget season, I often find myself looking more at the Article 7 bills as opposed to the actual appropriation bills. And by the time the budget's passed, when I feel like there is no political fires to put out and really get a chance to look at the finances, it's too late. This is obviously an issue that many people other than myself have brought up, but simply the amount of non-budget items in the budget makes it that much harder for a limited LCA and Albany's reporters to really dive into the nitty-gritty of where the money, like how much money is coming in, where the money is going, what is being appropriated for. So just it further just splits our attention and makes it that much harder to do good in-depth coverage of the actual finances.
I think there has to be a better way to understand where school aid money is going and how it actually comes out. I think I was working with Jimmy when I first started here covering education, and he said, "Oh, the school aid runs are out," and he just sent them to me, and I had no idea what I was looking at. And some of that is experience, but I think some of it is also it's very, very disjointed and unclear what the changes look like until I talk to folks like yourselves who are able to walk through that with us. And I think that there's probably a better way just to report those numbers.
I guess I want to do a follow-up question because we've heard a lot about access and people telling us things. And while I wouldn't say the city is always the best in this, it's clearly better than this. Access is much better than this. Why is, and Jimmy, I'll start with you and everyone else can chime in. So you've been around 15 years. Why is this the culture of Albany? What has transpired to make this so?
That's a question.
It's my job.
I think if you look at government generally, political and governmental reporting generally, what I always try to find are first people who have the information that I need, which is important, but then people who have an incentive to give the information, right? It's actually a pretty simple equation when you think about being policy X. The person A is acting as a course of action, but they know what's being talked about, so they'll tell me what's going on. And the same would, of course, be applicable to fiscal plan development. I think one reason that it's difficult is that we have one-party rule, or at least we have one-party rule for most of the time that I have been in particular corner seat. Now it seems Democrats have pretty strong control over both chambers of the legislature and Democratic executive for many years. So I do think that without a partisan incentive and with fewer, less conflict between the parties who are making the budget, there's sort of more an incentive and more of a predilection perhaps to just keep quiet. Everyone's rolling in the same direction. It's all good. And I think that might be one of the causes of New York's problems. One of the reasons that
Anyone else want to chime in?
I mean, process doesn't matter to voters, and I think politicians understand that. And so if it's easier to do their job in the dark, then they're going to get away with it. I mean, I come back to something Friedfeld said, where he made the case that people aren't dissatisfied with what they're doing. That's why we have supermajorities. I think people just aren't necessarily cognizant or fully aware of how these budgets are put together. And when he's making the case that just because CBC is unhappy doesn't mean we're not doing a good job. I think that's just sort of a misrepresentation of what's at play here. So yeah, I think that they benefit from not having as many eyes on something like a subsidy for the Buffalo Bills. So they have a vested interest in keeping it behind closed doors the last second. And there's no penalty for how they end up giving out that money. The penalty is for the policy decision.
I think there's an interesting dynamic of, oh, it used to be so bad, it's not as bad as it used to be, so it's fine. That I hear from a lot of people who have been around before I have. So like there's a precedent that this was terrible, so now look how good it is now, when that might not be the case.
So then
Although,
go ahead.
I just wanted to, just because you mentioned the city, and the city, obviously, New York City has one party rule, and, you know, the budget reporting there, I think is, I don't want to say better, but it's kind of easier.
I would.
It's definitely, it's easier to really dive into the numbers. And, you know, it's the first time that I spoke to someone covering the city budget. They're like, oh, the budget's due in June 1st. We'll have a budget agreement like by like mid-April. I'm like, mid-April? That's so, you have like an entire month to decide on, to like look at this stuff, and like they've actually got it all out in the open. I'm like, you know, in Albany, are you kidding me? We won't have it 3 days after the budget is due. We won't have an agreement. And so while I personally am still getting used to like looking through the various like units of apportionment or whatever in the city budget, you just look back at the, you know, the headlines about cutting $1 billion from the NYPD, the amount of in-depth reporting really breaking down what that meant, how much money was really being cut, where is going. Like there's just, for whatever reason, I mean, I don't really want to say one way or the other. Maybe it's just because of the general culture in Albany, but it's so much harder to do that in Albany, or at the very least, you don't see that quite as much. And so I don't think it can entirely be put on like one party rule, because that's been New York City for decades, and they managed to have a, you know, at least comparatively much more transparent budget